Hello, welcome to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, at least virtually. My name is Kate Neff and I work here at the museum. You might be thinking to yourself, though, I've visited Denver and I've visited that museum and I am not recognizing this place. In fact, it doesn't look like any museum I've been to. And that is because today we are behind the scenes. We are broadcasting live from the Digital Research Lab. We are super lucky because we are going to see a bunch of really cool stuff not available to the public, as well as have two amazing scientists who we're going to talk to in just a matter of minutes. First things first, if you're going to be an on-camera school, we're going to ask that you stay muted and off camera until we call on you in about 15 or 20 minutes and get your questions. If you are not on camera and you have questions, love it. We have a chat for that. Students, teachers, you can go ahead and post your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that Lindsay and Eldon get those questions answered. So without further ado, we have Lindsay, we have Eldon, we have two folks here at the museum who would love to tell you a bit more about this lab and give you a sneak peek to what we do here behind the scenes. So take it away.
Hello, welcome to the Digital Research Lab. There it is. Now you can hear me. Technical difficulties sorted. We do that a lot in the lab. Our lab is actually kind of a computer lab. A lot of the things that we do on computers because we look at CT scans of fossils. And so we CT scan these fossils and bring them to this lab space, put them on all of our computers and pull out all of the fossil material that we can.
Yeah, and before we get to show you a lot of the results of what we do, we have a poll question for all of you. Basically, it's why do we do this? What are the benefits of putting fossils in computers? Is it non-destructive? Does it allow us to look inside of a fossil? Or is it awesome because we can look at individual pieces and bones of things? Or is it all of them?
Students, if you have one-to-one computing, you can go ahead and answer on your own. Teachers, if you are responding on behalf of your students, go ahead and take a poll survey and post your best guess in that poll. All right, take about 3 seconds more. And how did they do? Let's see. What is the guess? Why do we do digital imaging?
So everyone answered all of the above, and that's exactly correct.
That is totally why we do CT scanning of fossils. All of the above. It lets us look at fossils without hurting them. CT scanning is non-invasive and it's non-destructive, but it does let us look inside of fossils too. So we can see inside of the skull and see the spaces where the brain was when this animal was alive, or look inside of rocks and see if there are even any fossils in that rock. All kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and it also allows us to digitally take apart a skull and isolate individual bones and pieces that we think may be important.
So what does this process look like, especially for our friends who are thinking, CT scanning, that sounds like something medical related, but how does it apply to fossils?
Well, it works very similar to how you might think it works in the medical field, but we basically end up with images like this. This is a grayscale blob, but it's actually a single slice of a fossil skull. And what we do is we take pieces of it that we think may be bone, and we paint over them similar to how you might paint over a picture on a computer. You can see here there's hollow spaces and little black spots. And we think those are actually the spots inside of a tooth. And we have rows of them here. So this is probably a mammal skull. And we do that about 2,000 times per fossil. So yeah, it takes a really long time, but the results are absolutely worth it.
Yeah, this actually looks a lot like this. So we can 3D print what we actually pull out of the CT scans. And this one's a really fun one. This is the specimen in that picture. And what you see here is the rock surface of the fossil as it was collected in the field. What we see, the fossil inside. So when you look in here, there's rock around this skull and you can't see it when you pick it up, but when you CT scan it, you see all these different features that tell us there's a fossil in there, and it's a fossil with teeth. You can see right here along the edge, Those are the teeth. And what we saw in that image were the hollow spaces that live inside of those teeth of this animal.
And that's all awesome. And part of the reason it's awesome is because before we get any of that, we a lot of the time have pieces like this. This is a rock. It looks like a rock. The whole thing would be probably egg-shaped, but on the inside, we can tell that we have some little sparkly, darker pieces, and these are actually parts of a turtle shell. But part of the problem that scientists run into a lot is you can't really figure that out without having to crack it open. So part of what we do allows us to look inside and figure out if there's anything in this once egg-shaped rock without hurting anything.
You're saying you can take a rock and you scan it a million times, basically, into like thousands of those really sliver slices, almost like a piece of sandwich meat. You look at it on the computer, you can paint on it using like a digital program, and then it 3D prints into that skull and like a plastic blob, basically.
Yeah, so this image on the screen is one of the first models that we made from this particular specimen called Unitosaurus. And you can see there are some pieces that are missing because this is a 250 million year old fossil. It's old and it went through a lot of stuff getting from being alive 250 million years ago to getting in the rock that we collected and were able to actually analyze. So what we did is look at every single slice for all of the features of bones. And when we were doing this, we were also tracing those shapes and kind of pulling out cranial features. So Alvin and I were spending lots of time looking at this, and we were able to isolate individual elements into color-coded bones, which is what you see here.
Yeah, and what we do with those color-coded bones is we slide them back into place, and we also like to color-code them based on their symmetrical counterparts. So if you have a nose bone on one side, on your left side, you're going to have that same nose bone on the other side. So that's the color coding you're seeing. But just as importantly, like I said, we can slide these back into place. So what you saw before was how the skull looked in the rock and before any additional prep had been done on it. And right now you're looking at a reconstruction. So a lot of those bones were missing. The blue one on the front of the face, that was simply gone. That was not there. And we were actually able to copy and paste that as a mirror image to the other side and complete it. And we did that for plenty of pieces.
Yeah. So for context, if you've ever visited a museum and you see maybe like a really big T-Rex skeleton, that T-Rex is not found in the ground like that. It is usually a bunch of broken bones that scientists have to work a long time to put together and make a whole skeleton. So they're usually not even the same animal. It's from like a bunch of T-Rexes and things. So that's pretty cool that you can do this on the computer.
Yeah, and when we do it on the computer, it allows us to test a lot of different ways they fit together. We don't always know how they fit, but we can have individual bones and move them around in 3D space and see if the line we think is there is actually there. And so we have a lot of different iterations of these tests that we've made, and we 3D print them in our lab so we can hold them and handle them and actually get a really good feel for how these bones are fitting together. And so these two are the same animal, but we've done a little bit of different things to them in terms of where we've placed bones to see what makes the most sense and whether or not the bones are fitting the way we expect them to.
Yeah, those may look the same, but if we take this pair of jaws here from the same specimen and we test our skulls, is this the right one? No, I think I want the other one.
Yeah.
Either way. So obviously, animals need to be able to eat. They need to be able to chew and swallow. So this thing here, this does that pretty well. This is really fun to do. Yeah, so this one is probably much closer to reality than the other one that we have, which this poor thing didn't close its mouth. We were supposed to have another one that couldn't. Oh, it's this one. Yeah, this one is the one we want.
3D prints because we print every version.
This is the one. This poor guy cannot close his mouth. So this hypothesis on how bones fit in the skull is probably not correct. There's a little nub here that interrupts the closing of the jaws. What just played was an animation of us about to test that sort of hypothesis.
We make animations because it helps us share this content with our researchers that don't live in Denver or don't work at the museum. We can send them the models so they can print their own 3D versions of this. But a lot of times it's easier to just send them an animation that shows the concept we're trying to work out. And so this is a really good one to show them how we think these bones fit together, because it does give our Unitosaurus specimen enough range of motion to open and close its lower jaw.
Yeah, and that's, again, like I said, it's more of a hypothesis or an educated guess. We don't know if the jaw is actually opened that wide. We're just showing it.
Kind of cool, because let me tell you this, having worked in the museum for a little while now, if paleontologists saw you doing what they just did with like the real thing, oh man, people would be in trouble. People would be in trouble. So these models are very cool. You can use them in a lot of different ways. So where are these models like print from? What can you tell us about that? And actually, I think we've got that device in the background, right?
We're super lucky. We had an NSF grant that gave us money to purchase this 3D printer. So we could 3D print all of the hypothesis that we have made about these bones and these cranial pieces. We have lots of ideas of how they fit together, but having the 3D printer has allowed us to actually print all of the bones separated. So we have a large cabinet here that has lots of cranial bones in it that we've printed super large. So we can actually test how things are fitting together and whether or not those bones are in the place we think they should be. And so we have our 3D printer here. We run it pretty frequently because we print as much as we can. And what happens is our prints come out of this tank at the bottom. You can see on the screen there, that's a finished print that's actually coming out of the tank. So it rises up like that. And this is a print from the project on the origins of turtles that we're working on. Another really great thing about 3D printing is that we can scale stuff differently. So that tiny little piece over on the left, that's the size of the animal's skull in real life. And the piece on the right is one that we made 5 times the actual size. So we could see a lot of these anatomical features without needing a microscope or a magnifying glass.
Yeah, and we actually have that skull right here after we've removed all those support structures just to hold it in place while it's printing. And now it looks a lot less like a roller coaster, and we can actually study it and view anatomy, compare it to, thank you, Lindsay, other animals that might or might not be related to it. And in the same as the actual size skull.
We do lots of scaling to make giant versions of small animals. And sometimes we make small versions of giant animals.
Yeah, I asked this question earlier. I said, how big of something could you print? So how big could that printer make?
Can do pretty big. I think one of the largest prints we have is actually a scaled up version of a leatherback turtle hatchling. So this is probably a few days old after hatching. It's very, very young, and it was CT scanned for our Origins of Turtles project. So you could do some comparative anatomy with this. This one's pretty big. It's about as big as my face, I would say. Much larger than reality, but it does fit right in our printer, just right here. And so we actually still have a little bit of room around it. We could have made this even bigger if we really wanted to. Most of the stuff has to fit within this space right here. But there are some things that we print that are too big that we have to print in pieces. And then we can actually put them together physically with glue and have a full size long bone from a dinosaur if we wanted to.
Yeah, we've also, is this person on site?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, it was. Yeah, we've also printed objects like this. This is the top jaw of a dinosaur called Majungasaurus. But the animal that this belongs to would have been a lot bigger. But this is the kind of size of the things we print, especially since a lot of what we work with is in, concreted rocks. So things like I showed you earlier. This one's also bendy. It's really fun.
Very cool. So, okay, you mentioned sharing research. Are you saying that if you have files, for example, you could send them to anyone to look at, but also even send them to be printed in other places?
Yes. That's actually the ultimate goal for a lot of the things that we're working on. We want to create this data that's accessible for everyone. just like we have collections at the museum, we're creating digital collections of digital fossils. And this is actually a really easy way to share all of these fossil specimens with the public and with fellow researchers. We can put it online and host it on different websites that everyone can access. And if you have a 3D printer, you can go to these places and download these files and print your own fossils at home or at school or in the library.
Yeah, and it's really great to have the CT data because Uninosaurus, which we showed you earlier, this skull here is currently sitting in South Africa and it's still being worked on. So we can have our version of it that we can work with and do literally whatever we want with while the real one returns to its country of origin.
Kind of cool because it's a good reminder too. Science takes a lot of different minds and a lot of different backgrounds, and the more people get to look at this stuff, maybe the more ideas we can generate and figure out what these things were used for. What is this thing that we're looking at now too? This is pretty cool.
Yeah, so this is actually a peek at some soft tissue anatomy structures inside Uninosaurus's skull. So using CT data allows us to look not only at the surface of the bones, but inside of them as well. And these are the organs of hearing and balance. And all the animals that we've looked at have these structures. They might look different and they might function slightly differently, but the basic structure is still the same. So the things that we're looking at are these arches that are called semicircular canals, and those are the organs of balance. And then the middle part is the body. That's the organ of hearing. That's the cochlea, and that's what actually listens to all the noises and transmits that information back to our brain. And these are super tiny structures that are inside an already really small skull. So being able to see these without having the specimen is really important, because if we had the specimen to see those spaces, we would have to break open the fossil, and nobody wants to do that when you have a beautiful fossil and you only have one of them.
And it's a really good thing that we can do all that because, bones are great and all that, but with these spaces inside of the skull, what we can figure out is a lot of things. We can obviously figure out hearing, since these are parts of the ear, but we can also figure out balance, which could tell us a lot about how the animal lived. So an animal that lived in trees is going to have a really different inner ear from one that may have been swimming or lived in burrows or even just walked around on land like us. We can also even get mass estimates. So we might even be able to figure out how much the animal weighed just from the inner ear.
These shapes. And here are two different inner ear structures from two different animals, but you can see how similar they are. They have a lot of the same kind of anatomy. So the semicircular canals are present on both of them. Their cochlea shape is different. These are different animals that probably were hearing different sounds, and they are also from different time periods. So the world looked different for both of these animals when they were around. And these are things that we're able to see in our CT scan that are very, very difficult to see in the fossils themselves. This is the actual size of one of those organs. And so here you have the semicircular canals and the cochlea there. And this is how big it actually is in this animal. It's pretty tiny, about how size ours are as well. So these live deep in our skulls. They're very safe around those bones that keep them nice and protected. And it's very important structures that help us understand how they were interacting with their environment.
And here's the skull that the inner ear we just went to. This is from an animal called Tinulabus. This is a mammal that lived from right after the dinosaurs went extinct. So probably 64 or 65 million years ago. And we are in Denver, Colorado right now. So this thing is actually pretty local. This comes from Colorado Springs in a site called Corral Bluffs. This animal in life probably would have been about the size of a beaver. So an inner ear, like the one Lindsay just showed, is really, really small. And it really helps to be able to print them larger or go into the CT data to inspect them more closely.
What's kind of cool is another thing that I didn't know until I talked to a paleontologist like a month ago is while we can figure out maybe what they're hearing, that it can also even indicate what sounds they made. People like to ask, what did dinosaurs sound like? Well, we weren't alive, so we don't really know. Yeah. But if we know what sounds they were hearing, they might have been making those same sounds to talk to each other.
Yeah. when we look at the cochlea, we take a lot of measurements about it. And depending on what it's telling us in terms of how long it is and how coiled that shape is, we can actually kind of pinpoint the frequency ranges that their ears could detect. And so using that information, if their ears can hear this range of sounds, it's really likely that they were also making noises within that range of sound. So it tells us what they could hear in their environment, but also how they might have been communicating with each other in their environment, which is really important.
I think you even mentioned earlier too, you said this can tell you a bit about how they live. And Eldon, you mentioned this, like whether or not they live in trees or like burrows and things, right?
Yeah. So part of how your brain tells where you are in space is there's fluid in these structures that sloshes around and pings other structures inside of them. So an animal that spends a lot of its time upside down would need to have structures conducive to that, ones that'll tell them that won't freak out when it's upside down if it spends all its time doing that.
Yeah.
Versus one that just is on the ground on all fours all the time. It's a lot easier to do.
Yeah.
Here we see a life restoration of Unodissaurus. So that was the toothy skull we just showed off. These animals may have been burrowers, and we're kind of looking in the ear to figure that out. We think part of the reason we think they were burrowers is because, well, for one thing, they keep getting found in burrows, and another thing, they certainly have the arms to dig for burrows.
So you're saying looking at, for example, where they're found, or even details like what their insides of their ears were shaped like, that could tell us where they lived, and we're able to make illustrations like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one thing to find a Unodissaurus in a burrow. It may have just been hiding from something, but to have an inner ear that's well adapted for living in a burrow,
And
that's much more solid evidence.
Looking at postcrania is really helpful too. So this is a sea turtle. We know it by looking at its phalanges. They're really long. It has these really long arms. This one doesn't quite match that. They're a little bit shorter. They look more sprawling, like maybe they had individual fingers. So looking at these two things, we can tell right away, looking from their skeleton, they were definitely doing different things with their arms. And so this is comparative anatomy. These structures are the same, but they look different because they were used in different ways.
Very cool. That looks like, we've got some image of a modern turtle with that Unodissaurus.
Yeah, so we think Unodissaurus may have been a turtle ancestor, which is why we have a turtle shell next to that, based on the ribs that you can see there. So that you're looking at the backbone and you can see the ribs coming off of it. They're turning up and broadening out, almost like they're going to form a turtle shell in a few million years. Humans have these same structures. They're in your chest, they're your rib cage, there would keep your organs and your innards stationary. But in Unodissaurus, they're a lot more flattened out, they're broad, they're very robust, and they're starting to overlap too. And there's some a mesh of that same specimen.
Yeah, scanned so you could see some of the internal anatomy too. So we can see the backbone and see some of those limbs that are underneath its rib cage, possibly future shell there.
Very cool. Wow, this is amazing. So I think at this point, I would love to open the floor for questions. If we could get maybe a host class from Carol Bauer in Mexico City, we would love for you to unmute and come on camera, and we would love to hear some of your questions. What would you like to ask Eldon and Lindsay?
Hello, good morning. We have a question. Does you can print any seeds? Any seeds for ancestral plants?
Ancestral plants?
Yeah.
Oh, can we print anything at the
Can we
museum?
print any?
Yeah, that if you can print like the seeds from the plants, from the fossil plants, I think.
Yes, we could. Actually, this is a question that we've kind of been thinking about a lot in our lab. Plants typically don't scan in CT very well because they're just so flat. There's not a lot of dimensionality in those scans, but sometimes we do get some impression fossils from them, and we can take digital casts of those spaces and then print them in our printer. A lot of the things we find in coral bluffs are palm seeds, which actually, if you look behind us, there's a photo of an animal eating a red one. This is actually a picture that we've created based off of things that we have found at this site. So if you look really closely, there's all kinds of plant materials out there. They're eating them. These are found in the fossil record, and we can collect them and scan them either with a CT scanner or with a surface scanner and create three-dimensional models of these little seeds and 3D print them.
Cool.
Thank you. We have another question.
It just comes down to if we have a model of it or not.
When you get the fossil, you take the ADN from the animal, DNA.
That's a good question. I think we are actually thinking about this for some of the fossils that we've been working on. Most of them don't have enough soft tissue remaining to extract DNA from it, but there are some fossils that are preserved really, really spectacularly, and they have completely hollow spaces inside of their tooth roots. And to that tells us that there was never any kind of infill of the rock or the matrix around this fossil. That space might still have some soft tissue DNA markers left in it. So we're trying to think about how we can best get into that space and kind of pull some cells from there and see if we can get any DNA evidence from those teeth fossils.
That being said, we're not going to be cloning anything anytime soon because DNA, even when it's really well preserved, can only last a few million years before
it degrades pretty quickly.
It just degrades and breaks down.
Thanks so much, guys. We have another question.
Sorry, but did you can simulate the evolution from those fossils
Evolution
as long term?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So that's one of the things we're doing with this project is trying to see what kinds of features modern turtles have and see where they show up in the fossil record and kind of date those features. So when does the turtle first have its shell? When do these turtle ancestors lose their teeth? All of these kinds of things are things that we're looking for when we're collecting fossils from all over the world.
Yeah, and that's something that Notosaurus has actually helped out a lot with. That's obviously on the way to a shell, like what I had shown you. And it's helpful for a lot beyond just turtles too. We mentioned Tyneolabus before. That one comes very shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, but it's pretty large for an animal that just saw a meteor light up the sky.
Yeah.
So we can tell that after the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, mammals particularly got pretty big pretty quickly. And that is absolutely a question of evolution that we can help answer.
I have another question. Where,
Let's snag
when
one
do
more.
you,
Yeah.
where and when do you know, when do you find the fossils?
Like, how do we know where to look?
Yes.
Yeah, good question. We typically look for clues in the geology. So we look at the dirt, actually, of places we are. We're looking for specific kinds of dirt that preserve fossils really well. And there's lots of places all over the world where this kinds of dirt exists. We're lucky that we have a lot of them open and exposed in Colorado, but a lot of the places that we've collected fossils are not in Colorado. They're all over the US. Some of them come from other places in the world too, because we know to look for certain kinds of rock.
Yeah, so fossils typically are found in what's referred to as sedimentary rock. So that's basically compacted sand that's been stuck together. It can be sand, silt, mud, whatever, just grains of a very fine sediment. There's also igneous rock, which is cooled and hardened lava. Obviously, you're not going to find any fossils in there. And then there's metamorphic rock, which is rocks that's been squeezed really, really hard and heated up so that the chemical structure of the rock has changed. But typically we look in sedimentary rock in areas where we think the environment that created those rocks could have also buried an animal or a plant very, very quickly after it died.
Yeah. There are some interesting ways fossils can be made. Down in the bluffs, down in Colorado Springs, we have a lot of the concretions, which are kind of like fossil pearls. There's a fossil inside of this rock, and it's been layered and layered and layered with this really dense, strong rock material, almost as strong as concrete. So that's why we call them concretions. But they look just like regular rocks when we pick them up. There's no knowing for sure if there's a fossil inside unless you crack it open or CT scan it and find out what's in there.
Great question. Goes to show that, you could probably find a fossil anywhere. That was an awesome question. If we could go ahead and invite Glacier Peak Elementary on camera and have them unmute. Thank you so much from Carol Bauer. Those were great questions. Hello, we can see you.
All right.
Real quick, hang on. I think, do y'all have a couple computers open maybe? We're hearing an echo.
We are too. Give me 1 second. We have two computers open. I'm just gonna have him put it in the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. We can hear you. We're just hearing multiple of the voices. There's an echo. So
Yeah.
you can probably hear it though.
Why is it important to look deep in the fossils?
Go ahead and
I
type
think is the question. It's really important to look inside the fossils with our CT scanning because we don't have to open the fossil. We don't have to break the fossil to look inside of it. We can do this on a computer and it's done digitally. So not only can we do this without hurting the fossil, we can do it a lot of times and test a lot of different ideas we have about what's happening inside of a fossil.
Yeah, so we can get things here like the roof of Uninosaurus's mouth. So when this was prepped out of the rock, when this was all the dirt was scraped off and picked off, the side of the face here and the roof of the skull, this was all that was exposed. But with CT data, we can go in and get these bones here. These are really important bones, partly because they can inform evolutionary trends. Different animals will have very different palates, and there's also teeth on the roof of this mouth. They don't show up incredibly well on camera here, but we have another upscaled element. This is a piece of bone here. This is something that would not at all, thank you. This would not be visible at all from the surface of a fossil. This is an area on the roof of the mouth, like what I just showed you, but you can see on the left, it's got some pointies there. Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, and those are teeth. And like I said, we just would not see those otherwise.
Very cool. So we've messaged Marcia's class through our kind of webinar chat. So maybe if you want to come on camera, but then just post your question in the chat, we'll be able to answer your question that way. We can still see you, but maybe we'll not have the feedback noise quite so much. What are other questions you have from Glacier Peak Elementary though? Hello. Yeah, good. Type your question in the chat. We can't wait to answer it. Ooh, how long does it take to 3D print? That's a great question.
Yeah.
It varies.
It varies. Something like this can take about 12 to 14 hours to print. This is a pretty large specimen. It's a big skull. We made it really big so we could see a lot of the detail on it. And so it's large and it's really detailed. So this would take a long time, more time than we have in a workday at the museum. But something like this, the same specimen, but much smaller, this would only take maybe 3 hours to print. So we could start this when we get to work in the morning and it will be done before we leave for lunch.
Yeah, and if we want to print something really big, what we typically do is we just leave the printer on overnight or even over the weekend, because we've had some 48-hour prints. But it can also depend on the position that we need to print in. Sometimes it's Sometimes it's difficult to support a structure like this lying flat. So what we have to do is we have to put it this way, or more accurately, like this in the printer. And this makes it take a lot longer. This bumped what would probably be another 12 or 14-hour print up to 36 hours. Also because we were printing 2 of these.
Wow. Okay. So that seems like it would take a long time. But I guess if you think about how long it took to make the models, which was sometimes years, that's pretty quick in the end.
It is a quick one in the end. It's just hard because we get really excited about seeing the final product. We just have to wait for hours until it's done.
Oh, man. Rough. All right. We can go ahead and go back to the classroom. We have the next couple questions from Marsha's class that we'll just read through the chat. And the first question from Glacier Peak Elementary I want to pose to you guys is, what is the coolest animal you've ever found? So, that's a hard one.
Animal.
There's so many.
Yeah, there are so many. Well, I really like mammals. I like their teeth because they're all very, very different, and different mammals have very specific teeth. So sometimes we can identify a mammal just by looking at its teeth. And we can do really cool things with their teeth too. If we use the first molar on the bottom jaw, we can take a measurement and use that number and find out how big that animal was. So we've been doing that a lot with a lot of the mammals that we found in Colorado Springs. But the one that I know the most and best is our good friend Tenilabus. This one is one that I spent a really long time looking inside the skull, looking at all the teeth on this animal. We did a lot of analysis of the soft tissue structures that would have been on and inside this animal's skull. And some of the things that we were seeing for this were the first time anybody in science had ever seen any of these structures. So it was really, really cool to see those inner ear organs for the first time for this animal and be the first person to put eyes on it.
Coolest animal I have worked on personally would probably be a lot of the crocodiles that we've worked on. We haven't published them yet, and we don't have models to show yet, unfortunately, but I'm having a blast working on those. Coolest thing I've found personally in the field is I've been on a few digs, a few paleo digs, and one time me and a colleague found a lot of jumbled up specimens of a dinosaur called Eolambia, which was a pretty decently sized plant-eating dinosaur that would have looked a lot like Iguanodon, if you're familiar with that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Sounds like coolest animal is kind of a subjective question. Depends on what you like.
Yeah, we've also looked at orangutans and gorilla skulls. And once we even got to look at a fossilized or a mummified bat that lives in our zoology collections. We had it CT scanned and it was very cool.
Yeah, just for context, the CT scanner, folks, we don't just use them here at the museum on fossils. We even use it on our very own mummies. We've got a mummy collection here, a small one at the museum, but we are able to look inside those bodies. It's pretty neat. We have another last question from Marsha's crew. Why do turtle shells have hexagon patterns?
Ooh, that's a good question.
So the hexagon patterns are not actually a part of the bone. They're more keratinous. So what that means is that they're made of the same material that your fingernails and your hair are actually made of. And that essentially functions, well, not functions, but is in a similar realm of skin. It's just covering over tissue. So
this one is a special turtle. This is one of those sea turtles, a leatherback turtle. And so this turtle has some of those geometric patterns, but it's not quite the same for what you see on a terrestrial turtle with a really hard shell. This is a soft shell turtle. It's the same structure. The ribs are still making up this shell carapace, but it looks different because it's for a different function. A lot of the things that we see and look at in the anatomy of these animals, they look different because they're doing different things. So they may be the same bone or the same element, but they look and feel different because they're used in different ways by these animals.
Very cool. Great question. If there are any other questions in our crew, off-camera crews, or just in the chat in general, Otherwise, I guess I have a question for the two of you that I think is kind of relevant, and it's how does someone become a scientist like this? If our friends in the audience want to do what you're doing today, how do they get there?
Well, I started in college. I went to a school and I knew I wanted to do paleontology. So I signed up for a biological sciences major. And that gave me a great understanding of anatomy and evolution. But what was also very important were the extracurriculars. While I was there, I volunteered in the lab of a paleontologist who worked at the school I was attending. And I did a lot of what I do now, just for a completely different reptile and different projects. But one thing led to another. I did a good job on my projects and my grades were good. And that landed me an internship here, which was funded by the National Science Foundation. And one thing led to another. And now I'm here as a full-time employee.
I have a slightly different background. My background is actually in human anatomy and skeletal anatomy. And I went to school to learn a lot about anthropology and mostly to learn about anatomy. And as part of those classes, I actually was exposed to using CT scans and MRI scans to learn about human anatomy. And it's the same tool and technology that we're using with our fossils. So I learned a lot about humans and all of our basic structure. And now I can use that information and apply it to all kinds of animals because the basic structures of anatomy, our skeletons, are really similar across all of these animals.
Very cool. This goes to show that it doesn't really matter how you get here, but you might still end up being able to work in an amazing lab like this. This was so cool. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Eldon, for being here. Thank you for joining us today and giving us your time, asking questions. We could not do it without an amazing audience like you. We have Kim behind camera, we have Asa, who is doing a lot of our tech off scenes right now. We can't do it without them either. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you will come again in January of 2023. On January 26th, we have our next broadcast. That's going to be Virtual Voyage Through the Universe, where we go way beyond Earth and in fact look into solar system and the universe kind of beyond the stars. So hope to see you again in January for our next Science in Action, Virtual Voyage Through the Universe. Otherwise, on camera schools, if you want to go ahead and unmute and say goodbye, we would love to see you off. And thank you again for coming. This was so much fun. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.